most recent book is the best-selling Green and Unpleasant Land, Creative Responses to Rural England's Colonial Connections. And the session is going to be moderated by Raj Par. He's a curator, historian, consultant and activist, and he's a contributor to projects at the National Trust, English Heritage and other cultural institutions with a focus on contested heritage and curatorial interventions to bring about culture so that institutions can begin to reflect diversity through their outputs. He curated the hugely successful Blacklash, No Justice, No Peace exhibition as part of Birmingham Museums and Art Galleries reopening, and is currently involved in many other curatorial projects. So a very timely discussion. Raj, I'll leave you to moderate and do the questions, and my sole duty will be to enjoy listening and come on stage and stop you at 1 o'clock. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. I'm not really going to moderate this discussion. We're having a discussion. So, shall I introduce you?
Yeah. Well.
So, my friend Professor Corinne Fowler, the author of this book. Now, I have to say, so that you don't have to suffer, I've actually read this book. It's very good. I'd avoid chapter 6 like the plague. It's absolute rubbish. So. Don't go through the torture of chapter 6, but apart from that, it's a very, very good book.
Chapter 6 is where I walked with him.
I was thinking, you've been involved with, it's not just this book, you've been involved with the countryside. Much of your writing, much of your thought process has been about the countryside. I was thinking the other day, in some places in India, you would have had your name changed by now to Corinne Colonial Countryside Wally. So I think I'll call you that. So, Corinne, let's begin. Could I just ask you, what was the motivation for this book, and the route that you took, as it were?
Yeah. Well, as mentioned in the introduction, I was one of the co-authors of the National Trust report, which was really looking at, it's sometimes known by journalists as the slavery report, which is ridiculous because most of the connections are actually Indian between National Trust houses and the British Empire. There are far many more of those, but they didn't catch the headlines in the same way as the smallish number of slavery connections. And so because that report came out, there was a big culture war around it, one of the first big culture wars that we had, in fact, and that lasted a good year, didn't it, Raj? It was really intense, full on, and I'm not really there to talk about how awful that was and, you know, how much it's kind of hostility there was around that report, which was basically an audit of peer-reviewed academic research produced over the last 20 years about National Trust houses and their many, many different kinds of connections to the British Empire. So when that came out, and because of all the, I came very, very close to lots of very, very angry people, and I had dialogues with them, and I really felt sad after answering some of the hate mail and the angry mail, and initiating a dialogue with people who felt really threatened by this work. I felt that I wanted to respond to the culture war with a kind of book that really addressed a lot of the things, the concerns that were raised. And so really this is my response to the culture war. It's a very peaceful book about the countryside, but it's also doesn't sanitize in any way the colonial history that I encountered. And I thought walking would be a good place to start because not only is the countryside quite a soothing place to have conversations about very sensitive history, but it's also walking is a good way of connecting with nature, connecting with ourselves, with each other, across generations, across cultures, across different perspectives. and I just felt that it was quite a grounded way of doing history. So, for example, I can't think of a single village church that I walked into where I didn't find some new colonial connection just by looking at the memorials on the wall. Someone who'd fought in the Anglo-Afghan War, as we call it, or the so-called Indian Mutiny, or who had died fighting against Tipu Sultan or something like that. It's all there to see. Walk into any little village church, however small the place. And so I really wanted to explore that further, but to not talk about history as a series of plain facts, but to think about what that history means at a human level and what those landscapes mean.
But, I mean, one thing you're slightly underplaying, we as well as sort of collaborators, we're also friends and neighbors. And I know that it really took quite a toll on you. The abuse that you went through, a really massive, and it was a very difficult time as well. It was during around about COVID, the COVID lockdown, etc. And I'm still, I mean, I was reading something just the other day in the book, and there's a quote by Claire Fox, Dame Claire Fox, saying about Jane Austen, "Oh, don't worry about all, don't read all that stuff about slavery or colonialism, etc., particularly slavery." She said, just read the novel. And I was thinking this morning, would anybody say that about, oh, don't think about Joseph Mengele and his experiments on people and tortures of people. Just enjoy the dentistry. Just have your teeth fixed. And so I just want to come back to you about why do you think it is that something so simple, so obvious to the eye, that wherever you go, as you say, that this country, our home, yours as well as mine, and our children's, has a deep, deep economic and cultural basis in colonialism and slavery. Why is it that question, handled so well in this book, arouses so much vicious hostility?
Well, from all the conversations I had with people that got very, very angry about the National Trust report, and there were a lot of them, I think there are a number of reasons. I think there are, at a political level, it gets used as leverage for political gain, and that's really quite cynical, a kind of corruption in a way of mobilising and weaponising history to try and win votes or alienate people from each other. It's a divisive tactic. But I think that for the people who wrote to me, I think that they felt that this history was so unfamiliar to them, and as it was once to me, that we were making it up. and I think there are very few indications in the countryside that these very profound histories of empire even exist in places which are seen as kind of classic idyllic places, nice pastoral scenes, rolling green hills and little villages, but you could almost put a pin. After writing this book, I realised you could almost put a pin in a map of any part of rural Britain, and you're going to come up with a really interesting, unique story drawn from Britain's 4 colonial centuries. So I think I myself had a very thin education in colonial history, in British colonial history, and I share that with most people in the UK today, especially of a certain generation who celebrated Empire Day and had the kind of propaganda, the official propaganda of empire fed to them in the guise of history. And now obviously we are at a time when we are more questioning about sources and how we interpret those sources. I think some people see it as an existential threat of some kind. They kept calling me anti-patriotic, but I don't see why you're unpatriotic to tell the truth and to look at the evidence. It's there for all to see.
Well, I'm looking at this audience, and it occurs to me that there are many, many people here who came into puberty with "I wandered lonely as a cloud." So my reaction to reading that chapter, which is my favorite, was, and I'm looking around here and I'm thinking, you've really completely fucked up their lives. Yeah, the trauma that you've caused them by exposing Wordsworth.
Well, they haven't read it yet. When
well, you should read it. Yes.
yeah, I mean, I've got a series of walks, and so I've got a cotton walk, a copper walk, a sugar walk, and they're from different parts of England, Wales, and Scotland. And the second walk I do is an East India Company walk through the Lake District with the photographer Ingrid Pollard, who was my companion for that walk. And that is all about the history of Wordsworth and his circle, because William Wordsworth, we know him as a poet, but if you look at William Wordsworth, the businessman, you get a very different kind of history emerging. And it's there, and it's been there in plain sight for a long time, but I just really felt it was time to walk through the Lake District. So I started in Grasmere and walked all through Wordsworth country in a kind of 11-kilometre loop. By the way, the book has maps of the walk, so you can do the walks yourselves as well, wherever's nearest to where you live. But William Wordsworth...
And you designed the cover as well.
I didn't.
You did
That was the last one.
You lied to me.
I did not. That was the last one. You're getting confused.
Oh, yeah.
The Wordsworth story is all to do with the East India Company history, because then, as now, writers need money in order to write, to have space and time to sit there at a desk and actually physically compose the poems. And so he was looking for always patrons, but he was very suspicious of patrons because he felt that they might apply all kinds of pressures he didn't want to be subject to, and he wanted his artistic freedom. So his brother John was an East India Company captain, and he was put in charge of a very lucrative sailing route. So his ship, the Earl of Abergavenny, was due to sail from Weymouth on the very lucrative route via India to collect opium and then to sell opium in China in exchange for tea, and opium was where the real money was made. And so John Wordsworth said, well, to his brother, you are a fine poet and I want to support you so that you don't have to take a patron. And so my walk is all about what happened when William Wordsworth accepted this, that, yes, go and make money on opium, come back and bring the money back for yourself. We will all retire. I will write my poems. You will retire. My sister Dorothy will be fine as well, and it will pay the bills and so on. But it didn't work out because the ship sank off the coast of Weymouth, and it went down with the investment of William Wordsworth, his sister, their relatives as well, and also John Wordsworth, who died in the shipwreck. So I tell that story and sort of talk about how William Wordsworth's wider circle also were involved with the East India Company. Charles Lamb, for example, he hated it. He worked for the East India Company for his bread and butter money so that he could do what he really loved, which was poetry. And I go into all that history on the walk amidst very scenic settings.
Scenic settings, yeah. And I also, in that chapter, I also felt that it's a slippery slope. Seeking which patrons is a slippery slope. And Wordsworth starts with, in a sense, to me, the zenith is not walking lonely as a cloud. Is the ode to Toussaint Louverture, that this is a new era, this is a new time, that he's so happy. And it ends with seeking the patronage of, is it Sir Peter Lowther?
It's the Lowther family.
The Lowther family, who are very deeply involved in very nasty things. And he has to go and defend, really publicly, he has to defend his patrons' defense of slavery and other very, very nasty things. So beware, any of you who want to seek rich
William
patrons.
Wordsworth, he was actually right about patrons, because when, obviously, they lost the potential East India Company profits as a revenue. And he had a growing family to feed, and he had bills to pay, and he was responsible for his sister also, and his sister-in-law's sister, and various other hangers-on. And so he really needed to earn money in another way. So he did become a stamp collector, which is well known, where he was distributing, when I say collecting, he was distributing stamps. And for the kind of Cumbria region. But he was also, took on some patrons, and his father and his grandfather had a long association with the Lowther family, who owned plantations in Barbados, amongst many other things. They had coal interests as well. And Lowther really compromised him in terms of his anti-slavery commitments. He went against those. So Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce, they all hung out in the Lake District in the summer mostly, and they had houses there and so on. And they were friends of the Dorothy and William Wordsworth. But when Lowther became his patron, Lowther was was pro-slavery, and William Wordsworth really in many ways betrayed Clarkson. I mean, first of all, he wouldn't distribute his anti-slavery leaflets in his local area because he said there wouldn't be any interest, and he wasn't in favour of immediate abolition anyway. No. But initially he really was. He wrote that poem, as you say, to Toussaint Louverture about the Haitian uprising and in solidarity with him. And they were good friends of the Clarksons, who were famous anti-slavery campaigners. But when Lowther became his patron, not only did he not distribute those leaflets, but he also wrote letters on him, almost spied on him, and sent letters to his patron to say what Thomas Clarkson was up to and how over-committed he was, embarrassingly, to this anti-slavery cause. So, I mean, I know that Wordsworth scholars always talk about the radical Wordsworth as a young man and the more conservative Wordsworth as an older man, and some stages in between. But I think that does provide some very interesting context.
Yeah, and also it's about, I mean, let's talk about this, because we need to address this nuance, or as we said once, fucking nuance.
You said it. It's in my book.
I actually thought that would make a really good title for the book. It's all about fucking nuance. Yeah. So let's talk about nuance. I mean, do you think, we've discussed this so many times, that I feel that really in almost kind of we're conditioned as beings to just either see that or see this, either see light or darkness, good or bad. And yet I feel, I mean, and that much of what comes through the book and much of what I think connects us, both of us as friends, is the value of nuance, that life is nuance. And you think about, I mean, the walk that you and I went on in that terrible chapter in the book, chapter 6, don't read that, was about Hastings, the Governor General after Clive. And to me, one of the best things about that book is about Hastings, and my fascination with him is that Hastings is like the meat in the sandwich. So you have this complete, utter reactionary Robert Clive before Hastings, who had no interest whatsoever in India, Indian culture, Indian history, Indian arts, anything at all. He just wanted to make his pile of money and get out. And you have Hastings, who commissioned a lot of work, a lot of research into, I mean, I'm always very honest, the bottom line for the East India Company was the profit, how much we made and how much we spent. Within that constraint, Hastings does a lot of what I think is a lot of good work, which is bringing India's past to the present. And then the other side of the sandwich is Lord Cornwallis, yeah, a complete loser in life, yeah. He's lost the American colonies, and yet he's rewarded with the governorship of India. And again, like Robert Clive, never learned a single word of bloody Indian languages, never had any interest at all. And that, to me, is the value of nuance. That one of the reasons I'm slightly easier on Hastings is that I think he was much more appreciative of India. And he called India my home, didn't he? He called my home.
And he wrote
India.
an introduction to a translation of the Bhagavad Gita.
Of the
I
Bhagavad
think.
Gita, yes.
And he said that, these texts will be around long after the British leave India.
Yeah,
He said some interesting stuff.
Some
But in that walk that we did, I think one of the interesting things about East India Company former officials was that they tended to gather in the same places. So in my first walk, which is just an introductory walk, I walked with Satnam Sanghera to Basildon Park, and that area of Berkshire was known as the English Hindustan because so many former East India Company officials and their friends settled there within close range of each other. But it's the same for the walk that we did, because in chapter 6 we walked to a kind of Indian palace in Cotswold Stone,
yes,
like a Mughal palace in Cotswold Stone. If you haven't seen it, Seasonkut Manor, do go and see it. And the walk is relatively short, that one. But
you managed to get us lost.
I did manage to get us hopelessly lost, but yes, we'll come on to that.
So by the way, at this point, we all know that no animals were harmed in the writing of this book. Can you assure people that no walkers were harmed either?
Oh, I can't
you need
guarantee
to kill
that. I mean, I got Barty lost. She did my cotton walk around on the moors around the mill town of Darwin, which is
poor Ibrahim
incredible
also.
story.
I mean, he didn't have a good time.
Ibrahim in my banker's walk in Hampshire. He comes from Senegal. He's an expert in slavery history of Louisiana and the link with Senegal and the Gambia. And he is really not into walking. He drives everywhere. And so I asked him if he was okay halfway through, and he said his feet were killing him. And then towards the end, he said his feet were still attached to his legs. But he still enjoyed it. He loved it. He said he lost loads of weight. Just from that one walk.
This one walk, yeah.
But I think, coming back to the walk we did around Seasonkut Manor, that area is a good example of how those East India Company officials used to live close together, because the people who were responsible for Seasonkut looking as it does were the Cockerell brothers, and one of them served militarily under Warren Hastings, and then later Cornwallis when he was governor. But Warren Hastings himself was settled in Dalesford. There's a very posh little shop and kind of restaurant called Dalesford.
I did not like.
Which you need an awful lot of money to buy anything in there, but it's worth going just to see the cheese
£2,000
shop.
for a jumper.
Which the cheese shop alone is, it's got its own door and all its shelves with all these beautiful cheeses labelled and everything. But Warren Hastings lived a carriage ride away, and there was a dialogue between Warren Hastings architecturally as well and the Cockerell brothers, well, the second one in particular.
I mean, the Cockerell brothers really, in a sense, they epitomize within the family, within just one family, the almost the story of the East India Company and Brits going abroad to make shed loads of money to come back, if they could come back alive, because so many of them died, to come back and really live very grand lives. And interestingly, at Seasonkut, I took a niece of mine, very troubled, darkly troubled niece of mine, at a very bad time in her life, to Seasonkut, and she offered an amazing insight that we both were really surprised by, pleasantly surprised by. And she said, "I live in Birmingham," she said, and it just reminds me, our stupid teachers would take us on a shitty, rainy, bloody day to see some manor or some palazzo or something the other. She said, and here, less than an hour's drive from Birmingham, is a place that for once in my life makes me think that I, an Asian, Indian, born and bred Briton here, born in Britain, that I have a stake in the system, that this is part of my heritage, that the two cultures, the two countries, are connected by hundreds of years of heritage and history, and perhaps that's the sort of value of that conflicted heritage that our schools, our education system ought to be taking. So I think she was sort of like the first voice of nuance that came.
Yeah,
we came across.
it's funny you should say that also, because in some separate work that I'm doing, I'm working with Neil Chakrabarty, who's a professor who's in charge of the Centre for Hate Studies.
Yeah.
And we've got a project called the Rural Racism Project, and we're having 100 conversations with people of colour who live in or visit the countryside. The fact that they've lived in the countryside for hundreds of years is something I try to bring out in my book, that some of these rural places used to be more multicultural than they are today.
Yeah.
But leaving that aside, one of the things, the themes that is coming up in these 100 conversations we're having is that colonial history in the countryside and the colonial history of the countryside is a big magnet for people of colour to come and visit these villages, hamlets, fields, forests, woodlands, and it's really an important factor in people actually visiting in the first place. It doesn't put people off, it's quite the opposite.
Yeah. Could you just expand on something you just said? That there are, this may come as a surprise. I know it came as a surprise to somebody this morning when I mentioned this. You say that there are places in England, there are places in Britain which are less diverse now than they were in the 18th century.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the chapter on that.
Yeah, so a good example of that is the tobacco walk that I took in Whitehaven with the writer Peter Carlew. And that is a fascinating case of a place which is known, even on the National Trust website, because they own the Whitehaven coast. It's known as a history of coal. But actually, it's a history of coal and tobacco, because many, many residents in the town owned tobacco plantations in Virginia or Maryland. And that port of Whitehaven, which is like a little down-at-hill place now where, you can just imagine chip papers kind of rolling through the streets, but it's a real place of faded elegance. There was once, obviously, a huge amount of money coming in there. But it used to be Britain's third most important tobacco port, and it was a slave trading port for some 80 years in the 18th century. Responsible for transporting tens of thousands of enslaved people. Anyway, so because of that connection, and it's so rich that I had to cut the chapter right down, because I had to cut out the East India Company history altogether, because it was going to be a 50,000 word chapter and I wanted them to stick to about 8,000 to 10,000 words. So I'll write about that somewhere else at another time, but the tobacco history is so strong and it lasted such a long time that even the port of Whitehaven has these shallow water ports and a deep water port, the shallow water port being for the coal ships, and the deep water port, which is seriously impressive if you go in low tide, because you have to crane your neck to look up at the docks, is for the transatlantic ships that would sail around the coast of Ireland in order to sail across across the Atlantic, partly for slave trading, partly for the tobacco trade. So because of all this coming and going, in a period of a few decades, the local records in 3 local churches alone have got 66 records of people of African heritage and sometimes Indian heritage living in this tiny place of Whitehaven, working as servants, as brewers, and 66 in a short period. And that's just a local church. You can see the baptism records, the marriage records. People married locally, they had children locally. Probably there are still some descendants who might pass as white, but are actually descended from that time. So that is just one example of an economy and a local built heritage and a former population which was completely immersed in the colonial context. And now it just looks like an ordinary town with a tiny port on the northwest coast.
So one of the allegations that was often made of anti-slavery campaigners in the 18th and 19th century was that while they were very vocal about being anti-slavery, that they didn't really think much or give any thought to the sufferings of the English poor, the English working class.
Yeah.
And I was reminded of this, and this is a real bugbear of mine. I mean, I would not review a book unless I've read the bloody thing from beginning to end. And yet our national newspapers and prominent magazines are full of people who've not read this book, but written reviews. And one of the reviews last week mentions that, well, exactly that.
I've only got 2 bad reviews, by the way. All the reviews are brilliant, except for the Telegraph
And the
Spectator.
And the Spectator.
Yeah.
So this guy makes the same allegation that she's written this book about slavery and the East India Company and so on and so forth. But what about the English working class? So how did you deal with that?
Well, so yeah, what happened there was I was on the Today programme talking about my book, and I got this really puzzling question, which was a supposed criticism of my book, like 8 days before it was published, of my copper walk. And it was basically, you say that the copper was used to sheathe slave ships, but it was also, the criticism is that people are saying about your book that these ships were also Navy ships. And I thought, well, hang on, I did say in my chapter that they were also Navy ships and that they needed to be sheathed with copper from Cornwall in order to protect them against tropical waters, also barnacles and other things. And they also, on a callous level, made those ships sail much faster, and so the death rate on those ships, which were slave ships, was much lower because they could cut a few days off the journey because of this copper sheathing. And I kind of answered the best question as best I could and thought, where on earth did that come from? The book's not out yet. Anyway, someone located it for me. It's an article in The Spectator published 8 days before the book was even published. My book was even published. Saying that I'd not spoken about barnacles, not spoken about Navy ships, and I was distorting colonial history. And it's all in there. It's like, I know that person could not have read my chapter about the Copper Walk. And this is really, really dishonest. Really the ends justify the means. Try to discredit this book before it's even come out. And so I noticed a few days ago that because it's behind a paywall, I hadn't spotted it before, that on the same day there was an article in the Telegraph saying similar things, kind of caricaturing my work and basically saying that what I'm ignoring is British labour history and the suffering of the working classes. My entire book is about this, because I said that this book is a response to the culture war that I found myself in the middle of and dealt with as well as I could. But one of the questions that was most often asked to me was, why aren't you talking about British labour history? Yeah. Why aren't you talking about the suffering of people who worked in the cotton factories, the child labour, the agricultural labourers, the toll puddle martyrs and all that? And I thought, on one level, they were asking me the question sometimes in a hostile way to try and shut down the conversation at all. But on another level, I thought, well, actually, I've also got a thin education about colonial history too. So let me just look into that. And at that time, I just happened, before I'd started writing about it, happened to be at Raj's house. And as we often do, we have our conversations facing his bookshelves, because I'm always wanting to borrow one of his books, and we always want to talk about what he's read.
And I cry when you borrow them.
And yeah, basically, he pulled down from one of his shelves the 1968 history classic by E.P. Thompson, the making of the English working class. And there are many criticisms of that book because it's mostly about male experience, for example, than female experience. But I thought, okay, I'm going to read this and go through it with a fine-tooth comb. So I read this book about British labour history. It was very illuminating because I didn't learn about any of it at school, apart from just a few little bits and pieces. And every few pages, a colonial figure would pop up. And I thought, hang on, he was the governor of
That's right.
Jamaica, wasn't
Jamaica,
he?
yes.
Hang on, he was an East India Company official. Hang on. But E.P. Thompson, that wasn't his subject. You know, colonial history was not his subject. So he was mentioning these figures in passing. And it really influenced this book, you lending me that E.P. Thompson book, because basically the entire book is looking at how labour history and colonial history is intertwined.
Yeah.
And it's a really fascinating adventure that
I think
took
it
me
wasn't.
on.
It wasn't anybody's subject, to be really honest. I mean, we're coming towards the end, because one of the things we want to do is to open the floor to discussion as well. So you can chime in. I want to just say that one of my friends said to me, we met after 30 years, and he said, Raj, when we were at Lancaster, we studied the Industrial Revolution, the effect of cotton and tobacco and sugar and so on and so forth. Do you ever remember anybody making a connection with the slave trade and with colonialism? And I'm thinking about this 30 years after, and I'm thinking, no, nobody made that connection. So this is, you know, the line that I take is that this is the creation of, something like this is the creation of new culture, really. You have clashing ideas about our past, and this is the product of that clash. And what it does is that not only does it enlighten, a book like this, not only does it enlighten us, I think it adds to the gene pool of knowledge that all of us can benefit from. And I think that's the approach that we've argued. I do want to open the floor to discussion. I just want to say something personal. It starts really badly, but ends well. When I was talking to my sister-in-law yesterday, and I said, I'm going to be at the Khushwant Singh Lit Fest, having a conversation with Corinne. And my sister-in-law said, my mother hated him. So that's a bad bit. And the reason I want to say that is that the Khushwant Singh Lit Fest takes place in Kasoli, and I grew up at a school. I went to a school, this public school, on one of the hilltops from where we could see Kasoli, Dikshay Public School. And I didn't know that the Lit Fest was in England and in Britain now. So I'm very, very, I think it's really, really good news. I just want to say something about Khushwant Singh, that he loomed large in my childhood. My parents sent me off to this public school, and suddenly I was open to this world of something called the Illustrated Weekly. So this image that you see, the Sardar Sahib enclosed in this light bulb, it loomed large in my life. He was an extremely, extremely influential person. My generation had never seen anything like, we're about 10, 12, 13. We'd never seen anything like the Illustrated Weekly of India. And then as I grew up, started to read about his I haven't read everything written by Khushwant Singh, but I've read more than most of what Khushwant Singh's written. And of course, everybody knows his novel, The Train to Pakistan. And people know about his very kind of close relationship with Fakir Sahib Ajazuddin, and his ashes being interred in the village school in Hadali. I could go on about Khushwant Singh, but just to say that I think a lot of people may not know much about him, but a really, really fascinating figure. And the reason that my sister-in-law's mother hated him was because, unfortunately, in India, the man is largely, to most people today, known for his joke books. And that, to me, is a very, very sad kind of sort of legacy in many ways. But for me personally, he was a towering figure, and he helped hugely in my development as a human being. So this is a real joy and a pleasure for me to be associated with this. Right, okay, so we have about 18 minutes. So any questions? Yes, yeah, over there. Yeah, please, speak loudly, please, yeah. Oh, you have a microphone.
He's got a microphone.
Oh, wow, you've got microphones, okay.
Thank you very much. I had a question, Corinne, on India, and I asked this question because Kemi Badenoch, who is the business secretary and Minister for Equality, said the other day that in Britain's Industrial Revolution, the wealth that accrued from the colonial connection and from the slave trade made only a minimal contribution. What is the truth? Did India, the wealth that came from India, apart from enriching particular individuals, did it help the Industrial Revolution?
I think that's a really important question. So, first of all, on the Kemi Badenoch thing, there is currently a disinformation campaign about British colonial history, and I think we should be really worried about it, because there are some really popular books out there about how colonialism was a really good thing, and it's really simplifying the whole discussion. We were talking about the importance of nuance and evidence-based work, and in the case of the sources that were used and the way in which that history was being discussed in that 60-page report that Kemi Badenoch was basing her assessment on, it was cherry-picking research, distorting research, and basically misrepresenting the economic history of slavery and so on. But, I mean, something that I found in my book is that one of the biggest legacies of colonialism in rural Britain is land ownership, because it's about imperial wealth. So this is why I write about things like enclosure and the loss of common land and things like this, because the same people who were East India Company officials and sometimes slave owners or descended from slave owners and were inheriting that either East India Company wealth or the slavery wealth or wealth of other various colonial kinds, but those two in particular, that those were the same people who were becoming local magistrates, MPs, landowners, were throwing people off the common land, were driving the population into wage labour, whereas before people had been more self-sufficient. And so all of that is connected. It's just the kind of forgotten driver behind it. So, for example, enclosure, which I won't go into much of the history of now, but, that gradual privatisation of the British land over a long period, it actually intensified at the height of colonial activity. So, and that's no coincidence at all. So, in terms of the Industrial Revolution, the mill owners, the copper mine owners, the people who were owning ironworks and so on, they often tended to have a colonial connection, and I explore many different types of those many different examples in my book.
Just on that, just a very quick example, as everybody knows, the railways in India were not made in India. Everything, the rails, the engines, everything came from Blighty. So to say that it had no effect on us. Okay, over there, and then after that, you, sir.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to touch upon what you said about, if I can call it, some sort of collective amnesia about empire and all, specifically amongst the generation that you mentioned, grew up with Wordsworth's poetry. But if you turn the mirror to India, there is also this whitewashing and this amnesia that runs through a large swathe of influential people. And therefore, I was struck the other day when I met people who had come back from India from that category, that influential, wealthy class, the adulation and the reliving of the glory of empire, not just amongst what they see, but from what they get from the people over there. It sort of reinforces that, it was a good thing. So I think it's on both sides, this whitewashing.
I think empire produced many writings, and there are many different layers of ideas about colonialism, and whether that was pure trade, a drive to make profit, or whether there was a kind of cultural imperialism which took place. There are many different aspects to and motivations behind the general colonial effort. And I think that rather than thinking of it in terms of good or bad, it's much more helpful to think about what is the history. I feel that in Britain we have quite an insular conversation. I don't know about the Indian conversation so much about, I get snatches and glimpses of it, empire, and I'm sure that nuance is always needed. But I think that if Britain is ever to acknowledge or address its colonial past, we as British people need to know what it is in some detail. And I think there's a lot to learn. I've certainly spent a long, decades acquiring knowledge that I didn't have and educating myself on many levels, because I think that's what we kind of left to fend for ourselves a little bit there. And I think that more knowledge is always a good thing. And it always helps to have, like you say, a more nuanced conversation about that colonial past, and to understand that you can't, to take an example from Satnam Sanghera's book, Empire World, driving on the left-hand side, I mean, that's a legacy of empire. Are you going to say that's a good thing or a bad thing? You know what I mean? It is just what was changed, what was the impact. But I say that without ever wanting to. I don't shy away from any colonial violence or any of the violence, particularly of slavery, in my book. There is no sanitising going on, and I think we have a responsibility not to do that. So,
the gentleman right to you.
And I think we've got another question.
And yes, I have, yes, yeah, I have, yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. Fascinating talk. But just to correct you, Satnam Sanghera is Empire Land, but that's an aside.
He's got Empire World is his second book.
Sorry, my mistake then.
Recently, so.
Anyway, that's a digression. I just wanted some clarity on the Wadsworth. Is that the Lauder family, as in like Estee Lauder?
Lowther. Lowther. So
Okay.
The father had an association with James Lowther, whose family owned a Barbadian plantation.
Okay, but my main question is really about you said that you're doing this project, which is looking at the history, talk at the 100 conversations in the countryside, and one of the things that's come up is that the reason why people want to go and visit is because of these links with the past.
Well, it's not the only reason.
But the main reason. But what I wanted to ask you is that, do people actually want to live in the countryside? Because I remember a Runnymede project many years ago where it was trying to encourage Black and Asian people to live in the countryside. Thank you.
Yeah. No,
Can I just say, I don't want to live in the countryside, but I want to go and walk there all the time.
Yeah, I think there are many people of colour in the countryside, and they make a massive contribution to the economy, to the local economy. They work as care workers, they have takeaways, restaurants, independent shops. They drive taxis.
I will come back.
There are also professionals and people working at all levels. In hospitals, local hospitals, all kinds of work. And this labour tends to be invisibilised in many ways. And in terms of visiting the countryside, that's a different cohort of people, often from the city, who may or may not feel comfortable. I mean, I know you don't always feel comfortable because people often describe feeling uncomfortably visible in the countryside. And one of my the postdoctoral researchers on my project with Neil Chakrabarty, his name is Vijay, and he also has a visible disability too. And he went to Haworth, where he was visiting the Bronte parsonage. He's a big walker, he's got a dog, loves taking his dog out and visiting all these heritage sites and so on. And he was greeted with a pub door in the village with a racial slur and a man brandishing a knife saying he had no place in the countryside. So he did a blog about this. And in this blog, he described this and some other instances of racism, really quite direct hostility that had been experienced by some of his interviewees. And underneath his blog are hundreds of people aggressively denying that that ever happened and saying, oh, are the trees racist? Are the fields racist? It's really, really troubling that there's this constant denial that there is ever a problem. But I do think that history can help us think through some of these things. And so that's why I talk wherever possible about local history of an African, Indian, or any other kind of presence that I've found in the countryside or that other people have found in that local area. And I think it's really helpful to remember that history so that we don't falsely remember the rural past as having been wholly a white past.
I mean, I have to say, I'm not exactly a shy flower, but when I go to I'm not, am I? So, but when I go to the countryside for walks, which I love, I have to be really, really honest. I prefer to go in the company of my white friends or my white family. You just feel more secure if you've got that sort of company around you.
So, so we need a more inclusive countryside, and we need more awareness raised about this issue.
So we've just got two more sort of quick questions now.
Thank you so much for your courage and your truth-telling. It is so important. I have two quick questions, if I may. The first is whether you've been in contact with Keir Starmer, who I think would be interested in your book. And the second relates to your views on the connection with current health in Britain, the state of the nation's health, and colonialism, thinking of products like sugar, products like tobacco. I'd be very interested in your comments, please.
Yeah, I definitely don't have a deep knowledge of kind of sugar and tobacco kind of as it comes to us today. But I'm sure that there are many interesting connections, and there's certainly many interesting historical and financial connections. But yeah, no, I haven't shown. I don't know. I don't have access to Keir Starmer. You know, I hope that it's really important to say that successive governments, whether they be Conservative, Labour or coalition governments, have failed to provide us as a population with even a kind of decent working knowledge of colonial history. And I hope that that will change. And I feel that after the kind of initial shock and the toxicity of these discussions, that we need to decontaminate our public conversation, and that there are ways of talking to each other across these divides which are much more helpful than shouting at each other. Hence, your question's important because it really, the way in which we write and talk and speak to each other is as important as almost as what we're saying. So,
a very quick question.
Sorry, taking some time to get the mic on. Is it true that Cornwallis, having lost America, you mentioned him earlier on, when he became Governor General in India, sort of decreed that no Brits were allowed to buy land in India because of what happened in America and the fact that they had to leave the land they had and return?
I think that's
the code.
There is a legacy of that.
Which is why all these historic houses came up here.
It is true, but I don't. Unfortunately, we don't really have time. Whether it was inspired by what happened in America, that much I don't know. I think the conditions in India were very, very different. So unfortunately, we don't really have time to go through that now. But I
think there's a landowner. The legacy of that was felt with the Indian farmers' protests, and we talk about that in our chapter. But yeah.
So we can have a very quick one now. Yeah.
I wondered. I know that Satnam Sanghera, I've heard him speak, said that he was looking to change the syllabus that children are taught, right from primary school. I wonder whether someone who's eminent like yourself would also be participating in that, because there are interesting...
I used to be a teacher, so I had a project called Colonial Countryside, which was a child-led history and writing project. And so I'm intending to continue that work. I've produced curriculum materials with teachers for lots and lots of primary schools and for Colonial Countryside. And they were free resources that were could be taken off the shelf almost, just used in classrooms. But I want to do it the same with this book. So if anyone knows, any good contacts to help us do that, that would be great.
Okay, I know you're already...
Make one remark. It's not a question. I was very struck by a comment that Bishop Rose, who was on the panel of Question Time this week, and as usual, the migrant question came up, and she said, I'd like to remind you all that Britain went as economic migrants to a lot of countries.
Absolutely, yeah. I think they were economic migrants, 100%. I also wanted to say, I've got this it's normally £25, but it's £20 out there and £15 for students, so out on the table.
And I just want to finish on that. So I want to thank Corinne, and because...
And it's on audiobook, much cheaper, but don't tell the publisher I said.
Because we're friends and we're neighbours as well. These weren't just leisure walks. There's a tremendous amount of research and hard work that has gone into this book, and I would hugely recommend the book to everybody. Please buy.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much to both of our speakers. That was a wonderful ending to the morning session. And I'd like to ask everybody to be back here promptly after lunch at 2:00, when we're going to have an exciting session with Shirin and Marina Wheeler. So may I give you your...
Oh, thank you very much. Wow, this is a surprise. Thank you.